Ladies.
Who's going first?
Huh?
Go on, Robyn. Okay, so I'm Robyn. I'm from South Africa, and I run KATO. So basically, we do product development in emerging technologies, and we do it a lot in South Africa. So we go into different places in Africa as well. We teach people how to code, how to use hardware, and then we work with clients to find out what their problems are. We get funding, and we come up with solutions, and then those get invested in, and people basically form companies from there. Yeah, that's what I do.
Yep. Okay, I'm Claudia. I'm the founder of EDGIZE. We are focusing on innovation development with a special focus on creative technologies, creative engineering, and creative coding. So our passion, or our loveliest projects are when hardware meets software, the so-called cyber-physical system, how to set them up, how do the sensors need to communicate with each other. This is what we really love to do with our clients. Besides that, my background is in arts, in the digital arts, so I have a strong focus on this field of art, science, and technology, where all of this come together.
So my name's Suzy Moat. I was speaking before. As I explained, I'm an associate professor of behavioural science at Warwick Business School, but at the same time, I'm a fellow of the Turing Institute in London. So this reflects a mixed background in both computer science and psychology. So in general, the work that I do and the work of the data science lab at Warwick Business School that I direct with my colleague Tobias Price, our work seeks to try and use data from the internet to measure and predict human behavior in the real world. But as part of that, we've been really interested in how we can use data from, for example, games to try and measure things we just couldn't measure before, such as the aesthetics of the environment we live in.
Thank you very much, ladies, for presenting yourselves. Yes, as basically we tried to sample for this kind of panel people who had a bit of an art background in art education, and also people who work with technologies and behavioral science. So it's great you all combine both. With introducing myself as well, I come from the arts and now work in a media that focuses on tech-related topics. So. Starting with this, we were discussing as well with the panelists, with you before when we were preparing for this topic, that we first need to define the terms, right? So are we talking really about aesthetics, or are we talking about beauty? So maybe we should start with saying, like, with defining what exactly is beauty. Perhaps, Suzy, you would like to start with your input, with your research.
I think this is a really good point. It's this question around definition is something that we feel in our work we do have to be really aware of. So I felt a bit guilty, titling my talk, Understanding Beautiful Places with Deep Learning. But actually, what we asked people was how scenic they thought a place was. And maybe beauty and scenic, how scenic a place is, maybe that doesn't mean the same thing. And there's all sorts of other adjectives we could come up with in the general concept of aesthetics. So yeah, I'm excited about the data that we've got at the moment, based on this one adjective, scenicness. But it is something we need to bear in mind when we're trying to collect data and indeed develop new technologies that can perhaps understand these characteristics on their own.
Mm-hmm. What do you ladies say about this question?
Like we said before, that I was talking about, do we talk about aesthetics or the beauty? Because, I'm the aesthetic guy, or women here on the panel, because I think it's a question of perception. This is what aesthetics mean, and when I have looked at your research, it was very, very interesting for me from a totally different perspective, because I did a research in when did we start to accept photography as the original image of reality? When did we start this? Because a photography is not the same like our visual perception. There are differences. But with the invention in the 19th century, the central perspective by Alberti became the model, the calculatable model of reality into a new technology and a new media. And for example, this thing which was called topography, and topology moved into topography, because we made so many images of around the world, like your research had also inside, that we need to find machines or invent machines that can extract all this information. And this was already in the beginning of the 20th century that the people start to think of building machines that extract the data from photography.
Can I just say something to that before Robyn jumps in?
Please.
So I think this is an interesting question about are photos really reality? But with my social scientist hat on, something that we have to grapple with is that we very rarely get perfect data about humans or perfect data about the world in general. And so from our point of view, we've thought that having all of these photographs, at a street level, from where humans stand, it might not be a perfect representation of the world, but maybe it's a step in the right direction, and it takes us beyond, for example, satellite images. So I think you're right to say, are photographs really capturing reality? Possibly not, but I think trying to, maybe not aiming for perfection, but acknowledging the disadvantages of data that we've got, but trying to improve it all the time is a good way forwards.
Yeah.
Okay, so my view, I guess, on the beauty side of things. So my postgraduate was actually it's called sonic arts. It's the easiest way to explain it is the physics of audio and how it works and how to use that in a creative way. So I'm a composer by academia. So when I think of beauty and how we're perceiving beauty, I think of it kind of in the scientific way and then also the emotional way and how we actually feel about things. And there's been a lot of research that shows we were creating art long before we were speaking, whether this is in the form of something we see or something we hear, whether it's music. So it's very hard for anyone to actually say what is beauty, because we know beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but we've been doing this for longer than we were speaking. The other thing is, in my field, because it's music, I mean, they can break down Bach into kind of your limitations of how like a structure works and how you can compose a piece like him, that for a very long time in the music and composition, it's your restrictions, and that's what makes something sound like that. So when you give a robot creating something like with the same restrictions, creating a Bach or a Chopin piece, it's just as beautiful because as a human, you're using the same restrictions. So it's very hard to actually say what beauty is. It's, I guess, what you're feeling afterwards, not necessarily what the creation is.
I love how this has been wrapping up, because I feel this is kind of like all of these different points of view stating very similar thoughts as well, but basically talking about the facts and how you take the facts and then you analyze them based on the views of a lot of people and what they perceive as beautiful, right? You take the facts, you analyze them, and that is beauty. Then you come and you say, well, you challenge the idea of, is it really, how do you define it? Like, is it like, what is this term, Is it beauty or aesthetics? And then come and saying, well, it's what we feel. So it's like the intellectual, well, or not the intellectual, but more like, the emotional intelligence versus the logical, let's say, intelligence versus everything else. And I suppose that's the challenge when it comes to these things, right? And then I'm thinking, like, how do you define also technology? Because photography, as you mentioned, is a technology. It was a technology at the beginning, and now we just moved past it, and we don't see it as something that would challenge us or take away our jobs, for example, or take away our creativity. So maybe we need to take a step back and really question how do we define these things, and maybe. What is really, is it more of a philosophical conversation? Like, can really robots be creative? Can artificial intelligence really be something that we should be afraid of, let's say, when it comes to creativity? So what do you think?
It's interesting for me years ago in my undergrad, one of our professors, he played for us a Chopin piece, and he told us this was actually made by a computer. And instead of it hitting me like, this is so sad, a computer's composing this, I was like, this is so sad, because humans think that they're so emotional and they can create such emotional things, but it's not that. And I think at the end of the day, when you're thinking about that, like, where's the creative thing? Is it a human thing being creative? Can you automate something like that? I think what it comes down to at the end of the day is it's obviously these restrictions and limitations and how they are then something structured from it, whether it's fine art, whether it's music. But then the other thing that ends up separating us from the robots is, or the machines, whatever you want to call them, Kevin Kelly released a beautiful book this year, and he says in there that what he believes will happen one day is art that's created by humans versus art that's created by robots is going to be a lot more expensive, and only wealthy people can afford it. And I think at the end of the day, that's what will happen, is it's something that's a lot more unique and man-made versus a robot. That's my opinion on that.
Yeah, I would love to go a little bit back on the question, how do we define the models and what does AI mean, and why do we think that rational thinking and creativity is something totally different? Because in older time, I think it was Plato who invented this world of idea, and to the reality which is close to us, we only have access to senses. And at that time, emotionality and thinking, rational thinking, was divided, and some invented this term or this thing called imagination. We have it only since that time. So when Thomas Hobbes, on the modern time, defined thinking as calculating, then of course machines become better than humans because they can calculate faster than us. But for example, Immanuel Kant brought especially the aesthetics into the discourse again, and he said in his last critique of the judgment, okay, we need the emotional part and the rational part to get, ideas or to get epistemology. And this is a really big thing, that we have this emotional thing and the rational thing, and he brought this both back together. So to come back to the question, does machine can be creative? I think there are a lot of already artworks already who try to force algorithm to make beautiful things. But I think if we define creativity as really something which is out of the system, which was not really there before, then I'm a little bit skeptical if AI will reach this goal in the next 5 or 10 years.
What do you think, Suzy?
So I don't at the moment see a strong reason for why we wouldn't get there in the end. When is the end? I don't know. But beyond that, I don't see a strong argument for this. But I think, nevertheless, it is for us as humans surprising when we see computers do things that we previously thought were so human. So, for example, being able to understand concepts like beauty or these other sort of subjective elements of the world that we live in. But potentially there's real use in them being able to do that because they're things that often matter to us. And so if we can get computers to better understand these fuzzy concepts that matter to us, then we might be able to generate more data on these aspects of our world in a way that gives us measurements that can inform decisions that take our human nature into account more than for example, simple aspects of the world that we found easier to measure before.
But I mean, I suppose that's one thing that I was also thinking about your research, is that it's very specific, right? I mean, it is specific to the database that you collected with this perception of these images. So maybe if you collected different data, like other factors would come up, like cultural factors, like depending on where this data were collected, which range of age people had when they decided this, where they come from, right? So or how, like, whether women or men, like this kind of, let's say, parameters, especially for a data scientist, play an important role, right, in understanding the concept of beauty, right, or understanding art, as a matter of fact, if we go back to the AI and aesthetics topic. So how, like, in that sense then, like, how broad can this be, and how creativity can play a part, let's say, in technology?
Well, so you were talking about how people from different places or from different backgrounds, or who are just different in some shape or form, might have different perceptions of these aspects of our world. And I think you're almost certainly right. And this sort of first pass at trying to understand these concepts isn't going to pick up on these individual differences. You're absolutely right. And so, a further step could try to get a more culturally informed understanding of how these things vary between different populations. Because if we are seeing that, for example, beauty is related to well-being, then understanding what that means in different contexts is going to subsequently be of importance. But I think, a first step in understanding where there is some collective agreement, and we see there's some collective agreement because we see that in our data when many people have rated the same photograph. There's some variance, but there are broad trends that we can pick up on, and so that's hopefully one step towards being able to understand these concepts before we get a more personalized insight into what these really mean.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add on this note?
I would like to know if were the people who vote for your photographies, were they from the same cultural background? So no Chinese, Asia, Arabian people inside, only from England?
That's a really good question. So the way that we've done this at the moment, we haven't really collected particularly fine-grained information about who these people are. So potentially we could in the future. So all we know is that they are people on the internet. I would assume there's going to be biases to countries near us and communities near us because of the way the site was originally advertised. But again, indeed, perhaps an even more ideal data set would sample carefully or would separate people into different backgrounds so that we could see how these factors might affect this definition. And this, I totally agree that this would be an important step for the future. Yeah. It's just not something that we've got to yet.
Yeah, okay.
Because, I mean, with that in mind, I guess, like, going back to also what Robyn said, right? So the difference between, like, collecting perhaps art pieces from people that from humans versus collecting art pieces from robots, then maybe we can see that it's the originality factor or the differentiating factor of, like, how unique this data can be perceived, right? And maybe when it comes to creativity, the finishing touch is what we're putting into ourselves as perceiving that this is like this person's work, or putting the emotional element to it, that the making it more personal.
I think that's such a nice point, because anyone that's ever created anything that feels like it's a creative art aspect, it's you. And that's why people are so vulnerable with showing people, whether it's a poem that you've written, a book that you've written, anything, you're putting you into it. And right now, robots can't put them into it. So until that happens, which will probably happen at some point, yeah, you're making yourself vulnerable, and it makes that a lot more unique, which is a beautiful thing. That if you're perceiving that, because like right now, when I can, like I said, mainly speak about music, but when music is being composed by robots now, it's really, really beautiful. But essentially, whoever's programmed that algorithm has told it to structure it off this composer that I'm basing it off. So yeah, there's no emotion coming from the actual robot.
And what do you think? I could see, Claudia, that you want to say something. No? Any thoughts on this? No.
Well, I wonder if it's difficult to define what it means that something has come, from the robot. Or I do think we make this more mystical than it maybe has to be. We've been formed by our environments, just like a robot has been formed by its environment, or an algorithm, or whatever it is we want to talk about. If we come to definitions, we possibly need to start asking what creativity is as well.
I love it. Suzy, go on, please. This is what I'm waiting for. Please. No, but please go on your thoughts. It's basically like adding to this question of what's the value of getting computers to understand beauty. So perhaps like defining what is original really, and whether like is it we think it's personal, but then again, what's the value of actually getting the computers to understand our society, and then getting them, getting not necessarily putting it in terms of creativity, but actually quantifying the world around us and then understanding it through that spectrum.
Well, so from our point of view, relating to the kind of work that we've done, that something that we think is important is that in the past we've seen a lot of policy briefings around things that we could previously measure. So, for example, there's been loads and loads of briefings around green space being good for our well-being. And we're not trying to claim that green space is not good for our well-being, but it looks to us like the real story is more nuanced than that and draws on things that we as humans can perceive, such as the aesthetic appeal or scenicness of a location. So that's where it's important to be able to measure these things so that we don't make decisions based on slightly misinformed factors. And it's also useful then if we can get computers to understand these things too, because we can crowdsource data, we can crowdsource loads of data, but if we can get, for example, a computer to understand how attractive is a particular scene, and we can just generate these ratings automatically, that's going to reduce the resource that we need to try and come up with these sorts of large-scale measurements of a characteristic of the world that seems to matter to us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I agree. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm just thinking that I was thinking at the same time that you also confirm, maybe again going back to the same thing, confirming some biases or some prejudices, and then you're taking away the human element that seems to be like something that we're trying to define here, right? But again, it's a very philosophical topic. Yes, I'm wondering as well, because I did a similar talk recently about AI and aesthetics, and again looked at all of the art created by music created by robots, or the trailer was a whole trailer was made out of the scenes picked by a movie. The Morgan trailer was made by a bot, an algorithm. Similarly, writing whole stories or scripts creating by algorithms, and again knowing this fear, right? I think it's again going to the emotional value of this fear of how will this potentially affect our creativity, or how will this judge, how would we find, let's say, the human element in all of this? So,
well, I think what you were saying actually in the question before was interesting, because there's a very big difference between saying how does the viewer perceive something, and just because it's being created by a human or a robot doesn't make the way you're perceiving it any different. That's obviously up to the viewer. But I think when it comes to how the robot's creating it and the robot versus the human, it might happen one day that, in my point of view, when someone creates something, it is from everything that they've experienced, but how they're perceiving things. And until a robot's able to experience everything and perceive things a certain way and then have an output of that, so whether it is a film, I mean, right now they're given different scenes, they're shown specific things, and someone might actually also edit what they've done just slightly. Whereas we're not doing that. We're going I've hardly traveled, but I've read a lot of books, so this is the kind of music I read, so therefore when my art comes out, I'm going to paint something that is based on what I've experienced, which a robot isn't getting yet. So I think that is quite an intense thing to be thinking about.
What do you think, Suzy?
I think we possibly have slightly different points of view on this, because I don't think there's, in the same way as we experience the world as humans, we choose what we experience. To some extent, we don't to another extent. There's a whole wide variety of things that we can experience. But increasingly, what we're seeing is we're developing algorithms that can, process all sorts of data that comes in. It's not all being spoon-fed and chosen and selected. I think.
Are they perceiving it though? That's.
Well, what does perceiving
exactly
it mean?
I mean, yeah. I think it's been proven that a bot can be as prejudiced as humans. There was the Microsoft shenanigans that happened on Twitter, where it started feeding and then became a racist bot and started saying very racist comments. So I mean, it could be it can be as emotional, or it could be that side of the story. Again, though, I also see Robyn's perspective. Maybe because of my art background, I want to also put that last I like this personal touch. And I guess when it comes to having an art background and perceiving beauty or aesthetics in a different way, because aesthetics is not necessarily about beauty. One last question from my side is, I was wondering how come you wanted to get involved with this topic, or how come you ladies, Claudia and Robyn, you're both coming from art backgrounds. I mean, more of a sonic background, more of a digital arts background, but you decided to move towards tech. And you are a data scientist who are now pretty much studying beauty, so aesthetics. How come you decided to do these things? Like, what do you feel like it's the right combination between tech and art, I suppose? Why?
Okay, so sound is made up of waves, which can be taken apart into data, which you can control actuators. So like you can pick up sensors, control sound with the numbers that you're getting. So that's what I was doing in my undergrad. I did my master's in that. So I was using electronics and code to create interactive audio environments. So then when I started working, I was like, you know what, my passion's super into this hardware side. If I could incorporate audio into it, I would. There's not a lot of money in the market. So yeah, in order to do everything that I love and actually generate revenue, tech is like hardware and electronics and product development's the best thing. So that's how I ended up in what I do.
I like your sincerity.
Sorry?
I like your sincerity.
It's true.
I do it for the money.
Oh, it's not for the money. It's more so that I can actually live. It's hard. Being a struggling artist.
I know.
Yeah. Yeah, as you said already, my background is in this so-called digital art, and so there is, for me, not a big difference between art and technology, because in its origin, technology, techne means art in the old Greek times, and logos means the study of. So in my concept or in my idea, technology means the study of art. So all these kind of things which are disrupted now by the so-called new technologies happened already with the artists in the 19th century. All the artists got unemployed by the invention of photography, and we gave away the idea of the genius, the inventor, the artwork. We did collaborational work. So all this idea which come now into society, I need to say, we studied already. So maybe this is why I'm not so fearing about these robots that are taking all our jobs or so on, because these are all discussions also from the cybernetics already. So I think we shouldn't fear so much, because these are things which we are creating. We are creating technology, and making technology is a kind of really human thing, because this is what the people have said, that it makes a difference from us and the animals, because we are the things which make tools, which make technology. So yeah, maybe I have a very positive view on technology. And
I'm the same. I'm the same. And you, Suzy?
So I suppose as an academic, you get a certain amount of freedom to choose what you work on, and perhaps to be a little bit opportunistic. So I think with an interest both in data science and in understanding human behavior, one of the challenges is just finding data and methods and really interesting questions that all fit together. And so, you know, this is something where, you know, the data was there from scenic or not. Of course, we have the methods we need to answer these questions. And as a human, I think all of us, I feel like so many of us have this sense that we feel better in more attractive locations. And so it just looked like a fantastic opportunity to actually start getting some real numbers and some real quantitative insight into a question that's fascinated philosophers and planners and many people for many years, but which is just, there's been a really big obstacle to making progress because it wasn't something that we could measure, and suddenly it is.
Well, thank you. It's a very interesting research. So I think at this point, I would like to open this discussion to the crowd. Are there any questions or comments? Oh, there is one. Two.
To see. I can't see it. I can't even whisper.
Hello. I start. So, if you were to ask Einstein what was his motivation or inspirations for developing physical model, I think one of the things he would tell you is that aesthetic is an important component for his inspiration. Do you hear me?
I'm trying to.
Do you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Now, yes.
I was afraid of that. So
yeah.
I was just using maybe a simple example. So if we were to ask Einstein
Yeah.
about his motivation or inspiration for examining or understanding rules of nature. One of the things he will come up with, maybe exaggerating, would be aesthetics. And thinking about it that way, I was wondering whether when you study landscapes and try to understand what people consider as aesthetics or not, whether you find something that you could extrapolate to other problems, and whether, if that were the case, that you could rate other problems or other things, and to see whether they're aesthetics or not. Possibly, you could evaluate also models, and maybe a criterion for selecting model, which is usually things like that would be just another scores, because usually you use scores on accuracy and these kind of things. But maybe one could introduce a score that would be aesthetics. So, do you?
Yeah, okay, so
The problem is the acoustic or the formulation?
Yes, I know. We're well aware of that.
Okay, so I am going to try to make it very short. So, if you can extrapolate from your research things about what people find aesthetics beautiful or in general to other things, maybe you can do it for models, and maybe with that you have or problems, solutions, and maybe with that you have another criterion for model selection.
Is this addressed to me or to all of us or to Suzy? To Suzy.
Probably to Suzy.
Yes, please.
Okay, so the question was that if you keep the microphone, the question was that if we have identified some general concepts that relates to beauty, can we take that to other areas of aesthetics?
That's not.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm sorry, I was struggling.
I think to models, not and problem solving. I think not necessarily aesthetics. I mean, yeah, I think if I understand correctly, since you've been doing this research and you have identified what people perceive as beautiful, then whether you can take that same thing and apply it to other areas for problem solving and models that not necessarily related with this topic. Do I understand correctly the question? That's it, yes.
Well, I suppose, so we were able to do this in the first place because we had the data, because we had this beautiful large data set where people had rated these photographs depending on how scenic they have found them to be. So I think it does illustrate the potential for making similar progress if we crowdsource other data sets around other elements of the world that we're interested in. I think that there isn't a lot of reason to think that we couldn't extend this to other domain areas. I'd be interested to know what kinds of domain areas you were thinking.
Yeah, actually, it would be interesting, I suppose, to contextualizing a bit. Like, what do you mean by models or by problems? Anything. No, that would definitely not work.
Can I just say something?
Yes, please.
I feel like when you're trying to define all of this, it feels like the same as defining what love is. That it's something everyone's been trying to define since the beginning of mankind. And it's very hard to say what love is because even your own perception of love changes all the time. So that's my feeling on this topic. It's
I'm thinking.
That's how I feel.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm just thinking that it's about, I think sometimes we focus too much on the terminology of explaining the world in different terms, but actually if you see it, we're pretty much explaining the world in just different, it's just about semantics really. It's how you use the language to explain. You do research here to understand human behavior, and you are also doing, you're creating music to understand human behavior perhaps, I think it's just as broad and as specific as it can be. That's my opinion. There's another question.
Hello, I'm Richard. I'm physicist and 3D artist. I have a question to Suzy. Did you work on the relation between evolution theory and art? Can you explain how art came up as a consequence of evolution?
That's a great question. So it relates to questions around why we might see this relationship with scenic environments. So why might we feel healthier? Why might we feel happier? And there have in psychology been a lot of theories, in environmental psychology in particular, around this question. So, and a lot of that has been relating to evolution. So there's a theory about, biophilia, so that we search for places that look natural, that we think would have natural resources available for us. So I think what we have found, some of the results, some of which I think there's even more results than I had time to tell you about in 10 minutes. And some of those relate with other theories that suggest that we like being able to see for a long way, we like being able to have somewhere to hide, so prospect and refuge theory. But I think the fact that we're seeing it isn't just about areas being natural suggests that some of these previous theories that have been strongly based on these evolutionary ideas might need some adaptation. But definitely, it's a relevant question, and a lot of our work does relate to a lot of work that's been done in that area.
So we have 2 minutes left. We have time. Yes, one super quick question there. One super quick one.
Hello. Let's say if I create a robot that transmit emotions, but the theory of colors, and wants to create a piece of art with this robot, and I don't know, I randomize what the robot is doing. I don't know. Imagine I create this robot doing a paint. Based on the color theory, I can transmit what is the feeling of the robot wants to represent. Fuck. Would you say like the robot? I'm the creator of the piece of art that the robot is creating, or the robot by itself is the one who creates the piece of art? If
you want to know who's the author of the artwork, is it right? If it's a robot,
would you deny the participation of the robot as a creator of the piece of art because of the random variables that are inside the decisions that the robot took to make the piece of art?
I understand, but I would say what you describe as a project to make a robot that has a special set of colors and a special framework. This is what we call media art. So that there was already a long tradition in letting robots doing things. For example, I was 2 years a researcher in the Center for Arts and Media, and we had an artist group which was called Robot Lab, and they created they used KUKA robots, and they let KUKA robots making music, like DJing. They created a robot that has written the Bible and the Torah. So, and that feels you would call this kind of projects media or digital arts. But the question, who is the creator, we erased out of this project or concept. So we erased the artist or the genius.
Okay. So my question was related more, for example, if you fulfill the robot with knowledge, for example, transmitting emotions by colors, and you said transmit love, for example, and create some random operations that the robot can create with this. Would you be the creator of the piece, of the resulting piece of the robot, or the robot?
Yeah, again, the authorship, I guess. You're asking about the authorship.
Yeah, it's a question of the ownership. Who's the creator of the artwork?
Yeah, like philosophical question.
I think that's a philosophical question.
Would you,
we have to wrap it up right now, so I think that this is a very nice point to finish with, this kind of philosophical open-ended question. And I would like to thank the panelists for being here and discussing this very difficult, I think, and complicated matter. which is quite open-ended and contradictory in its own nature. So thank you very much, ladies, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.